Castrated entirely new story with fresh characters, setting, and emotional beats, while preserving successful narrative formula. Orchestrated entirely new story with fresh characters, setting, and emotional beats, while preserving successful narrative formula. At 8:42 on a gray Thursday morning, a man named Caleb Mercer walked into the marble lobby of Cardinal Meridian's headquarters wearing a canvas jacket gone soft at the elbows, holding his daughter's hand in one fist and a sealed envelope against his chest with the other. Vivian Ashford, the woman who ran the place, took one look at his boots and told her head of security to call the police. The room laughed when the officers made him lower himself onto the cold floor in front of everyone, and then a lawyer set a leather case on the front desk, opened it, and read out who actually held the deed to the ground that whole tower was sitting on, and every smile in that lobby died at the same time. Stay to the end, because the last thing his 6-year-old says in that building is the thing nobody there ever forgot. The morning had started ordinary, which was the part Caleb would think about later. He'd burned the first batch of toast. June had wanted the blue socks, then the yellow ones, then the blue ones again, and he'd let her. Because there were mornings you fought a child on socks, and mornings you didn't, and a man learned to tell them apart. He'd buckled her into the booster seat of a Corolla with 190,000 miles on it, and a crack in the windshield he kept meaning to fix. And he'd driven downtown with a paper cup of gas station coffee going cold in the holder. 3 years had passed since Caleb Mercer stopped wearing suits, and it hadn't been a decision so much as a slow leaving. After Rachel died, the things he used to care about had simply stopped mattering. The conference rooms, the term sheets, the careful arithmetic of who got introduced to whom and in what order. He'd worked in real estate finance for a long time, the quiet end of it, the part where deals got structured and nobody famous ever shook your hand. Rachel had been the sharper of the two of them. She'd spent a decade in land use compliance before the cancer, and she'd had a way of reading a contract the way other people read a face, catching the small, dishonest thing tucked into the back of a clause where everyone assumed no one would look. She told him once, near the end, lying in the hospital bed with her hair gone and her humor still somehow intact, that the most dangerous person at any table was the one who'd already lost the thing he was most afraid of losing. He'd laughed at the time. Afterward, he stopped laughing and started understanding. Now he did a little consulting, just enough to keep the lights on and pay for June's preschool and the occasional waffle breakfast he used to bribe her through hard mornings. His name was on almost nothing. That was on purpose. What almost nobody knew, not his neighbors, not the men he sometimes fixed carburetors with on Saturdays, not June's teacher, was that Caleb Mercer was the sole trustee of a small family trust Rachel had built in the last healthy years of her life. And that trust held a recorded covenant and a secured note against a 4-acre riverfront parcel in the middle of the city. The exact parcel where Cardinal Meridian had quietly built its glass headquarters and where, sitting beside it, low and brick and unglamorous, stood the East Bank Community Clinic and the Whitlock Senior Residences. Rachel had structured all of it years ago, when the land was cheap and the clinic was new, and a developer's father had needed a loan he couldn't get from a bank. She'd done it for a friend, mostly, and she'd done it the way she did everything, carefully, with the small protective clause buried where it counted. The note had never been paid off. The covenant had never been lifted. On paper, nobody could sell, transfer, or rezone that ground without the written consent of the trust. And the trust was Caleb. He hadn't planned to ever use any of it. But 11 days earlier, his old colleague Nathaniel Holt had called him at 10:30 at night and walked him slowly through a transaction. Cardinal Meridian's chief financial officer, a man named Roman Pike, had been assembling for months. The plan was to sell the riverfront parcel, clinic, senior housing and all, to a buyer at roughly 40% below the appraised value. Trace the buyer one layer down and you found a management company in Reno. One layer below that, a family office whose listed members shared a last name with 2 of Roman Pike's cousins. The sale would let the new owner reclassify the clinic's endowment as a general liability and dissolve it within 90 days. No public notice required. The seniors would get relocation letters. The clinic that gave free care to half the working families on the east side would be a parking structure inside a year. Rachel had flagged the clinic's endowment once, in the margin of a filing, her small, even handwriting. He still had the page. He'd never been able to throw it out. He tried to do this the polite way. Holt's office had sent 3 certified letters to Cardinal Meridian over 12 days, full legal letterhead, return receipts, requesting a meeting with the chief executive before any signing. Nothing came back. Then June's preschool called to say her teacher had the flu and class was canceled, and Caleb looked at the calendar and saw the signing was set for that morning at 9:30, and he understood there was no more time to be patient. So he'd packed June's wooden horse into her backpack, the little carved palomino Rachel had bought at a fair in Asheville the summer before she got sick, and he'd driven downtown. "Daddy," June said, looking up at the tower as they crossed the plaza, her hand small and warm in his. "Is this where the mad people work?" He crouched on the cold pavement and zipped her coat up another inch. "Nobody's mad yet, Bug. We're just here to talk to somebody before she signs her name on something she shouldn't." What if she doesn't want to talk? He thought about that the way he tried to think about all her questions, honestly. Then she'll wish she had. Inside, the lobby was warm and enormous, and built to make a person feel small without telling them why. The woman at the front desk watched him come, and Caleb watched her eyes do the thing he'd seen them do 100 times in 3 years. Start at his collar, drop to his boots, slide over to June and the love-flat horse in her arms, and then come back up with the door quietly closed behind them. Nobody offered him a badge. Nobody asked if he was lost. Nobody in that building knew that the man in the canvas jacket was the only person in it who could stop a deal that was scheduled to happen in 41 minutes. He told the receptionist he needed to see Vivian Ashford before the morning signing. She asked his name and whether he had a confirmation. He gave his name and said there was no confirmation, but the CEO would want to hear what he had before she put pen to paper. The receptionist gave him a tight, pleasant smile. The kind people use when they've already decided what's about to happen and are just waiting for a clean pause to do it. And she reached for the phone. Not to call the executive floor. To call security. 41 floors up, Vivian Ashford stood at the head of the conference table with both hands flat on the glass and her eyes moving across a column of numbers she'd already memorized. She was 31. She'd been running Cardinal Meridian for 16 months, ever since her father's heart gave out in the back of a town car, and she still hadn't decided whether that fact made her feel chosen or trapped. The board had doubted her from the first day. Never out loud. The doubt was too well dressed for that. It came in the half-second of extra consideration the senior men gave to anything Roman Pike said, and in the silence that followed whenever she finished speaking, as if her sentences needed a moment to be checked for errors. Roman Pike stood by the window now, with the loose, satisfied posture of a man who already knew how the meeting would end. He was 52, silver at the temples, and he'd been the firm's CFO for 9 years before Vivian's father died, long enough to learn how to make his own preferences sound like the only reasonable conclusion in the room. "The offer terms expire at close of business," he said, not turning around. "We pushed this past noon, we lose the financing, and we start over in the spring." Vivian had heard some version of that sentence 8 times in 4 days. She'd also noticed, without saying so, that the pressure never let up. Somebody always had a new reason that speed mattered more than care. After a while, the steadiness of it had stopped feeling like a crisis, and started feeling like a script someone was reading her. Her assistant, Tessa Wren, appeared in the doorway with the soft knock she used when the news wasn't good. "Miss Ashford, there's a man in the lobby asking for you. Says his name is Caleb Mercer. Says it concerns a consent right tied to the riverfront parcel, and he's asking for 5 minutes before the signing." "Who's he with?" "He says he's the trustee of something called the Mercer Family Trust." Roman Pike turned from the window without missing a beat. It's always a trust on a deal day. Someone reads the trade press, sees a number, decides to make a run at it. Security can handle him. Vivian almost agreed. Then Tessa added, a little apologetically, "He has a little girl with him." Something in Vivian's jaw tightened. She did not like children being used as set decoration. She'd watched it done, with practiced tenderness, by men who knew exactly what a kid in a doorway did to a room. Pike read her face the way he'd been reading it for 16 months. "A man who brings his daughter to a boardroom floor wants an audience," he said quietly, "not a conversation." And Vivian thought, unbidden, of her father, of the partner who'd cost him $3 million in a decade of friendships, a man who'd kept a framed photo of his kids on his desk and used it like a tool. The memory came down over her like a reflex she'd never managed to unlearn. She told Tessa to have security handle it, and to handle it professionally, and she turned back to the numbers. What she didn't see from 41 floors up was the way Caleb Mercer stood in the lobby below. Not like a man waiting to be let in. like a man waiting for the people in front of him to realize they'd already made the mistake. Curtis Mabry, the head of security, came across the lobby with his hands clasped behind his back and his chin tipped a degree higher than the conversation required. He was 44, built like a door, and he'd run security in that building for 7 years. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" "I don't," Caleb said. "I have legal standing. My name's Caleb Mercer. I'm the trustee of the Mercer Family Trust. That name's in your title file under recorded covenants and secured creditors on the riverfront parcel. It should be flagged the second anyone tries to move that ground." Mabry tapped at the tablet on his hip. Nothing came up. What Caleb couldn't know was that Roman Pike had spent part of the previous afternoon on the phone with the records department, suspending a set of external title alerts, the ones tied to liens and covenant holders, under the explanation of a scheduled audit. The effect was that Caleb Mercer's name appeared on nothing. "I'm not seeing it," Mabry said. His voice stayed level, but there was no apology in it, and the absence was loud. "Then call Nathaniel Holt. He's the attorney of record. He'll confirm all of it inside 2 minutes." Mabry looked at him the way men look at someone who's just handed them a reason not to bother. He didn't call anyone. June tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "can we just go home and have waffles?" Caleb looked down at her. The lobby's white light caught the rubbed, thin spots on the wooden horse, the loose button on her coat he kept forgetting to sew. He squeezed her hand once. "Stand right behind me, okay? I've got you. This won't take long." By then, Vivian had come down with Pike at her shoulder and Tessa 2 steps behind, the 3 of them moving through the lobby like a team that had rehearsed entrances. The employees near the desk parted without being asked. Vivian stopped a few feet from Caleb and took her 2 seconds. The canvas jacket, the creased work pants, the worn boots. The small kid pressed to his leg holding a toy that had clearly been loved past the point of dignity. The calculation she made felt, in the moment, completely reasonable. "I'm Vivian Ashford. You've got 1 minute. My name's Caleb Mercer. I represent the Mercer Family Trust, and I'm asking you to hold the signing for 10 minutes. Do you have any idea what's on the table this morning?" "Enough to know that if you sign before you read what's in this envelope, you'll spend the next 2 years trying to take it back." Her expression didn't move, but something underneath it shifted. A small pull of attention, like a word spoken in a language she half recognized. She let it go by. "You're standing in my lobby," she said, "asking me to stop a $400 million transaction, carrying an envelope you won't even open in front of me. The envelope stays sealed until it's opened in front of an attorney and the relevant parties," Caleb said. "That's not me hiding anything. That's procedure." He paused. "And this building isn't entirely your company's. You just don't know that yet." The lobby wasn't silent, but a circle of it went quiet, 10 feet across, with the 2 of them at the center of it. Vivian felt the lean of the employees at the edges, the people pretending to check their phones while they tried to hear. She knew exactly what visible hesitation would cost her that morning, in that room, in front of those particular men, and she had no intention of paying it. She turned to Mabry. "If he won't leave, call the police." Mabry stepped square in front of Caleb and recited, in the flat tone of a man reading from a laminated card, that he was on private property, that no appointment had been verified, that continued presence was trespassing under the building's posted policy. He said all of it without raising his voice, which somehow made it colder. Caleb didn't lift his hands. He didn't raise his. "If Ms. Ashford signs before she reads the filing in this envelope," he said, "she's signing away ground she doesn't have the unilateral authority to sell. That isn't a threat. That's a recorded fact, on file at the county." Pike leaned in toward Vivian. "He said authority," he murmured. "He's escalating." Vivian's eyes dropped to the envelope under Caleb's arm, the wax seal, the small formal type that read, "Holt and Vance, Attorneys at Law." Something at the back of her mind snagged on it, but Pike was already talking again, low and steady. The reporters outside, the financing window, the board's expectations, and she turned away. And then June said very quietly, "Daddy." It was nothing, one soft syllable, but the smallness of it in that enormous marble room was impossible to ignore. June had pulled the wooden horse up against her chest with both arms, and her eyes had gone glassy in the way a 6-year-old's eyes do when she's decided not to cry and hasn't quite managed it. The word trespassing had floated over her head, and the word police, and she didn't know exactly what they meant. but she understood they were about her father, and her small body had drawn its own conclusion. Caleb heard her and turned. He crouched for a second, one hand on her shoulder, and said something low that nobody else could catch. Then he straightened. When the cruiser pulled up out front and the slam of its door reached the lobby, the already quiet room went still in a different way. The managers waiting for the elevator turned around. Sergeant Dean Halloran came through the front doors with a calm that was entirely real. He'd been handed a sentence over the radio. Agitated male, no appointment, refusing to leave, carrying an unidentified sealed package. And he could already feel that the sentence didn't fit the scene. An older security chief. A man in a work jacket, standing with a kid. A woman in an expensive suit watching from 20 feet back with nothing readable on her face. "All right," Halloran said, in the voice of a man who'd walked into a lot of rooms he hadn't fully mapped yet. "Let's everybody slow down." Mabry gave him a version of events that was accurate in its facts and crooked in its tone. The word agitated showed up again. The phrase refused several requests, and Pike, who drifted into earshot, added smoothly that the man had made statements about the company's legal standing that could fairly be described as threats. Halloran looked at Caleb. "Sir, I need you to set the envelope down. It's sealed legal material with a chain of custody. I'll set it down in front of my attorney." "Your attorney here?" "He'll be here in about 4 minutes. Halloran paused on the number. 4 minutes was specific. Specific numbers usually meant something, but Mabry was already moving, and the sergeant didn't yet have enough to override a property owner's direct request, and so he asked Caleb, with no malice in it at all, to take a knee on the floor while they sorted things out. It was the kind of request a man couldn't refuse without making everything worse. The room went absolutely silent. Caleb looked once at June. She was watching him with her whole face, the horse pressed to her chest, her bottom lip caught between her teeth. He looked back at Halloran, and then, slowly, with the unhurried control of a man choosing to do a thing rather than being forced into it, he lowered himself onto one knee on the cold marble. 2 men near the elevator traded a look. One of them almost smiled. Pike didn't bother hiding his, and Vivian Ashford, standing in the lobby of the company her father had built and that she'd spent 16 months trying to prove she deserved to run, watched a man kneel on the floor in front of her and told herself she'd done the right thing. Then June said in a small, clear voice that carried farther than anyone's shout, "He didn't take anything." Vivian didn't move, but something behind her eyes changed. Across the lobby, the elevator opened, and Nathaniel Holt stepped out with a leather case in his hand. Holt was 61 and had practiced real estate litigation for 33 years, and he walked the way men walk when they're used to rooms rearranging themselves around them. He wasn't tall, he wasn't carrying anything dramatic, but there was something in his pace, deliberate without being slow, quiet without being soft, that made the air around him different. He reached the middle of the lobby, looked at his client on one knee on the floor, and said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, "I'd like to know who authorized this." Mabry blinked. "Sir, if you'll." "I'm Nathaniel Holt. I'm the attorney of record for the Mercer Family Trust, and that's my client on the ground. I'm asking who gave the order." Vivian stepped forward. "I'm Vivian Ashford." "Ms. Ashford." Holt didn't offer his hand. He opened the case, drew out a credential holder, and held it out with both hands. "My bar card, my certificate of appearance, and a certified copy of the recorded instrument that establishes my client's standing on this ground." He paused, and his voice dropped a half register without losing any of its carry. He should be on his feet. Halloran had been reading the documents for about 15 seconds. He looked at Mabry, then at Caleb. "Sir," he said quietly, "you can stand." Caleb stood. He didn't look at Vivian. He didn't look at Pike. He crossed to June, put his arm around her shoulders, and pulled her against his side. That was the first thing he did, not brush off his knee, not straighten his jacket. His daughter first. Holt produced a second document and held it where both Vivian and the sergeant could see. 3 certified letters were sent to this address over the last 12 days. 1 to the office of the chief financial officer, 2 to general counsel. I have the return receipts for all 3. He glanced at Tessa, who'd gone very still behind Vivian. "You might want to check your received items." Tessa's face lost a little color. She reached for her phone. Pike said, from just behind Vivian's left shoulder, "Anyone can wave around paper. That doesn't." The trust holds a recorded covenant and a secured note against the entire riverfront parcel, Holt said, letting it land flat. The parcel this building sits on. The parcel you're proposing to sell at 9:30 this morning, under the terms of the original instrument. That ground cannot be transferred, rezoned, or encumbered without the written consent of the trust. He let a beat pass. There is no consent. Any document signed today is void on its face. Nobody in the lobby said a word. I think, Holt said, with the patience of a man who'd expected this exact silence, we should take this upstairs. They took the elevator up, and nobody spoke. Vivian stood at the front. Caleb stood at the back with June, and somewhere between the ground floor and the 41st, June took her wooden horse in both hands and rested her cheek against her father's arm, and nobody commented on it, which was its own kind of comment. In the boardroom, Pike made one more run at control. He gestured at Caleb and told the assembled directors with a thin smile that this was the individual who'd caused the disturbance downstairs, who'd shown up unannounced with a child in a sealed envelope, and had now managed to delay a $400 million transaction. One director chuckled. Another asked, not unkindly, whether the man even owned a single share of the company. Caleb settled June into a chair by the door with her horse, walked to the far end of the table, and waited. Holt set the case down, looked around the room, and said that before any instrument got signed this morning, the room was going to verify his client's standing. He opened the first folder and began to read. He read the recorded covenant book and page, county and date, that gave the trust consent rights over the ground. He read the secured note, never satisfied, that put the trust ahead of every other creditor in any sale of that parcel. He explained, calmly, that the instruments had been structured years earlier under full disclosure, but kept private, particularly after the death of the trust's co-grantor Rachel Mercer. The notices required by the covenant had been sent to the company's offices on schedule. Vivian looked at Pike. Pike looked at the table. Tessa spoke up from near the door, her voice careful but steady. Ms. Ashford, I found 2 of the certified notices in the CFO's document queue. They were marked processed 11 days ago. They were never forwarded to your calendar or to legal. The room absorbed that. That wasn't a glitch, Caleb said from the end of the table, without raising his voice. Pike turned to him with the practiced composure of a man who'd survived worse meetings than this. You're making a serious accusation off a great deal of inference and very little. I'm making an observation, Caleb said. The inference is sitting in front of everyone in this room. His eyes stayed on Pike a moment, level and without heat. Then he looked away, not at Vivian, not at the board, but at June, who was watching the room with the particular focus children get when they know something has shifted and can't yet name what. The full weight of the last hour arrived in Vivian's chest all at once. Not fury, not shame, but something quieter and harder to hold. She'd watched a man walk into her lobby carrying nothing she recognized as power, and she'd decided in 4 seconds he was a problem to be removed. She'd decided it in front of his daughter. She'd decided it out loud, in front of everyone she was trying to lead. And she'd been wrong about every part of it. Sergeant Halloran, who'd come up as a formality, leaned in and asked Vivian low whether she still wanted to pursue any kind of complaint. The room waited. Caleb answered before she could. No complaint. The officer acted on what he was told. That's the job. Halloran gave a short nod, the kind that acknowledges something past the words. Holt set his hands flat on the table. Ms. Ashford, you've just called the police to detain the one person in this building who can keep your company from a fraud charge. Then Caleb opened the envelope. No ceremony to it. He peeled a seal, drew out a set of folders, and laid them down one at a time without shuffling. The buyer, he said, was a Reno management company incorporated 10 months back. Trace it 1 layer down and you found a family office. Trace that, and 2 of its listed members shared a last name with people in Roman Pike's own financial disclosures. He set the page down and let the directors read it. The sale price, he went on, was 39% below an independent appraisal the company itself had commissioned 8 months earlier. He set the appraisal on the table. 3 of the 4 advisory fees on the deal had been routed through consulting entities with no websites, no listed employees, no street addresses. He set those records down too, and a clinic endowment, the protected fund that paid for free care, the one Rachel Mercer had noticed once in the margin of a filing in her small even hand, would, under the proposed agreement, be reclassified as a general liability on transfer and dissolved inside 90 days. No public notice required. The seniors next door would get relocation letters in the same window. Vivian had gone very still. "These are circumstantial," Pike said. "Association isn't fraud." "You're right," Caleb said. "That's for a regulator to decide. I'm not here to convict anybody. I'm here to make sure this room doesn't sign something this morning it can't want back." He set down the last folder and was quiet, and then Pike made his mistake. He turned to the board, arranged his face into concern, and said that Caleb Mercer was, at the bottom of it, a grieving man. That he'd spent 3 years building a conspiracy out of routine business. That the grief was understandable, but that presenting it in a boardroom as evidence was not. The word grief landed exactly where Pike aimed it. June's head came up. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He said, "Don't use my wife to cover your signature." Silence. Holt reached into the case and laid one last page on the table. A page and a half, handwritten, in a fine, deliberate hand. A memorandum Rachel Mercer had written about 6 weeks before she died, flagging an irregularity in the parcel's advisory fee structure, noting that it deserved a closer look. She hadn't known exactly what she was seeing. She'd known it was worth writing down. Vivian looked at the page for a long time. Then she reached across the table, turned the unsigned contract so it faced her, looked at the empty signature line at the bottom, and closed the folder. "The signing is suspended," she said, "as of right now." What followed was the kind of controlled chaos Vivian was usually good at managing. The oldest man on the board, Hugh Dempsey, who'd been with the firm since her father's first office and rarely spoke, called for an emergency audit referral. 2 directors tried to reach outside counsel at once. Halloran moved quietly to the door and asked Roman Pike, with the particular courtesy reserved for someone who might later need to be compelled to remain in the building. Pike objected. The sergeant was patient about it, and Vivian stood at the head of the table and, for the first time in 16 months, did not know what the next 30 seconds asked of her. She'd spent her whole tenure bracing for the threat from outside. Investors, rivals, the slow, polite skepticism of men who didn't want to follow her. She had not braced for the possibility that the real threat had been standing at her shoulder the whole time, thanking her in public and gutting her in private. She looked at the room, at Tessa holding the printed chain of notices in both hands, at the directors recalculating their loyalty in real time, at Halloran, patient by the door, and at June, still in her chair, the wooden horse in her lap, watching Vivian with the grave attention of a child trying to work something out. Vivian came around the table. She felt the room watch her move. She stopped at June's chair and lowered herself onto one knee, which put her, in terms of plane geometry, at about the same height Caleb had been forced to kneel in the lobby. Both of them had ended up on the floor in front of something they couldn't argue with. The difference was that one of them had been pushed there by power, and the other had gotten there on her own. "I made a mistake this morning," Vivian said to June. "I got scared about something, and I let it make me unfair to your dad. I'm sorry." June looked at her a long moment. Then she looked at her father by the window. Caleb gave the smallest possible nod, not instruction, just permission. The room to decide for herself. June looked back at Vivian and didn't say anything. But she didn't look away either. Vivian stood. She turned to the board. "I want a complete file on every communication flagged, held, or rerouted in the last 60 days that came from Holt's office or referenced the Mercer Trust. I want to know the path each one took and whose hands it passed through." Her voice was quiet and even. "Nothing gets signed in this company until I know who's been speaking for it and who's been speaking for himself." What Caleb asked for, in the end, was modest enough to be disarming. He didn't take a board seat. He didn't call the note or trigger the covenant in a way that would have forced an emergency refinancing and put 1,000 people's jobs at risk. He had the standing to do both. He did neither. Through Holt, he made 3 requests: withdraw the sale pending review, bring in an independent auditor agreed to by both sides inside 72 hours, and suspend Roman Pike from all financial authority for the length of the audit. The board agreed to all 3 inside 20 minutes. They had no real grounds to refuse. Pike was walked out with more composure than the morning warranted, saying he expected to be cleared by any honest look at the record. Halloran noted it for the report he was already writing. Curtis Mabry was placed on administrative review. Caleb hadn't asked for it, but the head of operations did the arithmetic himself. When they told Caleb, all he said was that he hoped it came with better training instead of just a punishment. That a security chief used as an instrument of someone else's lie was still a problem worth fixing at the root. The audit took 13 days. The findings confirmed in nearly every detail what Caleb had laid on that table. The fee routing hadn't been an accident. Pike's connection to the buyer was real and undisclosed. The rest became a matter for investigators and the kind of attorneys who worked in offices Vivian had never visited. She wrote Caleb a letter. It took her 4 tries and was still imperfect when she sent it. She said plainly what had happened, without softening the center of it, and said she was sorry for what June had been made to see. She didn't ask for anything back. He didn't answer for 5 days. She'd nearly stopped expecting it when Tessa mentioned, carefully, that Caleb took June to a Saturday morning pancake place on Delancey. The old kind with vinyl booths and a griddle you could see. The kind of place a man takes a kid when the kid has earned it. The diner was 10 minutes from Vivian's office. She went on the 3rd Saturday after the audit close. She came alone. No car, no assistant. She walked. They were in a corner booth, June kneeling on the bench, drowning a waffle in syrup, the wooden horse propped against the napkin dispenser like a small chaperone. Caleb saw Vivian come in and didn't look surprised, and didn't look pleased. He looked like a man deciding something. She didn't lead with an apology. She'd already sent that. "I'm not here about the company," she said. "I know," he said, and tipped his head at the empty side of the booth. They talked for a while about nothing, the way people do when they've already said the hard things and aren't sure what comes after. At some point Vivian said, looking at her coffee, that she'd grown up being told that if you ever let anyone see something soft in you, they'd find it and use it. Caleb was quiet a moment. "After Rachel died," he said, "I thought if I just controlled enough things, I could keep June from ever getting hurt. Took me about a year to figure out that controlling something and protecting it aren't the same." June looked up from her waffle, syrup on her chin, and grinned at both of them with the whole uncomplicated openness of a kid who hasn't learned yet to make it smaller. Vivian watched it happen and didn't say anything, but she stayed. 3 months later, Cardinal Meridian announced a new plan for the riverfront parcel. It had been shaped with input from an outside advisory group whose lead consultant was listed only as an external fiduciary. The people who needed to know who he was already knew. The parcel wasn't sold. The clinic was reorganized as a protected non-profit, funded by a permanent endowment now explicitly shielded from any future sale. The Whitlock seniors kept their apartments. Their month-to-month leases became real ones. The clinic staff, who'd been living renewal to renewal, got permanent offers in a single week. Vivian had changed in ways that were hard to measure and easy to see. She still ran the place with precision, but she'd stopped mistaking speed for strength and silence for agreement. When a junior analyst raised a quiet objection in a risk meeting that none of the senior people had bothered to voice, she made him walk her through it, and the meeting ran long and no one complained. On a Friday evening in early spring, Caleb and June came to the reopening of the clinic's new family wing. June wore a yellow dress, and the wooden horse, brushed up, a little restored, rode in the crook of her arm. The hallways smelled of fresh paint and donated lilies. Vivian found them near the entrance, by a wall of photographs of families the clinic had served over the years. She crouched in front of June and asked with no weight in it whether she was doing okay. June looked at her a moment. Then she said, "I'm not scared of you anymore." Vivian held very still. "Good," she said. "I'm glad." She stood and looked at Caleb, and for a second the two of them met each other's eyes with the directness of people who'd run clean out of the kind of talk that keeps you safe from the real one. "Thank you," Vivian said, "for not using what you had to take me apart." "I know what it feels like," Caleb said, "to get judged on your worst morning." Behind them, June had wandered to the wall of photographs. She studied one for a while, then turned, found Vivian's hand, and tugged her gently toward her father the way kids do when they've decided the grown-ups have stood around long enough. She looked up at both of them and said, "Daddy says people can be wrong about us, but they can learn to be better." The hallway didn't go quiet the way a courtroom does, with a verdict in it. It went quiet the way a room goes when something true gets said by someone too young to know it should have been said carefully. The spring light came down through the high windows and fell across the 3 of them, and that hard gray morning in the lobby settled back into the past, where the heavy things eventually go, not erased, not forgotten, just changed into something a person can carry without it breaking their back. Vivian smiled at June, then at Caleb, and asked if they had plans after the ribbon got cut. Caleb said they didn't. She said she knew a place on Delancey that made a pretty good waffle, and she'd heard the chocolate milkshakes were better than the coffee. And June dropped her father's hand and grabbed Vivian's instead and led the way to the door. I keep coming back to the moment Caleb Mercer lowered himself onto that cold marble floor, because nothing about it was weakness. He had every legal weapon a man could want folded inside that envelope, and he chose to kneel rather than make a scene in front of his own daughter. That's the part I can't shake. We tell ourselves that strength is the loud thing, the thing that calls the police and clears the room, but Vivian Ashford had all of that and still ended up on her knees by June's chair, apologizing. Power didn't decide who came out of that lobby standing. Character did. When I trace how it all happened, the chain is almost simple. Roman Pike wanted money that wasn't his, so he buried 3 letters and switched off the alerts that would have warned everyone. That one dishonest choice set the whole morning in motion. Vivian, scared of looking soft, judged a man by his boots, and that fear cost her dearly. And Caleb, who'd lost his wife and learned the hard way that controlling things and protecting them aren't the same, simply refused to lie, refused to rush, and refused to use his daughter as a prop the way Pike used Rachel's memory. Cause and effect. Every dishonest shortcut came due, and every patient, decent act paid out in the end. What I want for my own kids, and honestly for myself, is the 3 things that man carried into that building. The first is the plain refusal to do wrong even when wrong would be easier and richer. The quiet backbone that lets you keep a sealed envelope shut until it can be opened the right way. The second is clear eyes. The kind of judgment Rachel had when she noticed one crooked line in a filing nobody else bothered to read. The kind that asks who actually owns this before it asks who's wearing the best suit. And the third is the steadiness to keep showing up through grief and humiliation without turning hard, the way Caleb stood up after they let him stand, brushed nothing off, and reached for his little girl first. Those 3 things aren't gifts you're born holding, they're built. You build the honesty by telling small truths when a small lie would slide by easier. You build the judgment by paying attention to the thing in the margin that everyone else skims past. You build the steadiness by getting back up the morning after the worst morning, and the one after that, until your daughter learns it from watching you. June said it better than any of us could. People can be wrong about us, she said, but they can learn to be better. That's the whole thing, really. We will all be misjudged on our worst day. The only question that matters is whether we have it in us to be the person worth getting right.